So good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event with Brookline Booksmith featuring Jane Fleishman and contributors to the Stonewall Generation, LGBTQ elders on sex, activism, and aging. My name is Alex. I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. It's wonderful to have you. And if this is the first time that you've even heard about us, welcome. We're really happy to have you as part of our community tonight, and we appreciate your support of the authors and the contributors and an independent bookstore that you're making through your purchases and your attendance this evening. This event was also made possible through the co-sponsorship of SAGE USA, which is an incredible advocacy and services organization that's dedicated to assisting LGBT elders. So thanks to SAGE tonight for helping us bring you here. As I said, the chat and question box are open. The chat, if you hit the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen that says chat, will open to one side. Make sure that you set that to all panelists and attendees. That way that everyone can talk during the event amongst themselves. If you have a question at any point during the event, you can click the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen and type your question there. That way it won't get lost in the chat, and Jane and the panelists will be able to answer a lot of those questions near the end of tonight's event. I'd also like to please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. I am really excited about tonight's event. I think although the landscape of LGBT and queer people has changed massively in the last 4 decades in the United States, that change has come tumultuously and unevenly. And it's one element of an entire era of rapid transformation. So what does that mean? It means that more children now have the language and support to survive queer childhood and understand themselves. It means new legal and political gains, new legal and political threats, and a completely new world of visibility. Different rules for how LGBT people are perceived, where they're permitted, what they're permitted, and how they self-conceive. But amidst all of this change, and some of it's wonderful, and some of it's painful, one thing that is frequently lost is the weight and value of intergenerational community. Queer history has been scribbled out many times by political violence, by social repression, by AIDS, and many other things. So generations that are already split by rapid technological and social change, by ever-evolving language and a lack of community space, are disconnected further from the legacies and lives of queer elders by all of those things. Both the lives of people we have lost and the lives of people who are still here, still living, still fighting, and proving the ongoing and incredible resilience, joy, and ferocious resolve of our LGBTQ elders. So today I'm introducing Jane Fleishman with great joy. She's a certified sexuality educator, researcher, and writer with more than 40 years of experience. She has a continued mission to promote the sexual well-being of older adults, has co-chaired national conferences for the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, and the Sexuality and Aging Consortium, launched a popular column on sex and aging for Live Well magazine, co-hosted the Our Better Half podcast, and hosted a monthly radio show, Sex Matters. She's joined by 3 contributors to the book, Mandy Carter, Edie Daly, and Joey Wasserman, and she'll be introducing them further. They're all incredible activists and people. I'm so pleased to be here tonight and to welcome all of them. So welcome all of them, and I pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Alex. What a great introduction. Hi, you all. I'm Jane Fleishman, and I just want to say a big thank you to Brookline Booksmith. What a great place to launch our book. I'm so excited to be with all of you tonight. I wish we were in the bookstore, but here we are. I also want to say a big thanks to Pierce Alquist from Skinner House Books, who's been an amazing gift, really, for this book and has been helpful around all of these promotional events. And Joey, I wanted to say a big thanks to you and to SAGE, because without SAGE, we wouldn't have our co-sponsor tonight. And I really wanted to say a big thank you to Mandy, to Edie, to Joey, and to Jackie Merkin. So Jackie, you can wave too, because I didn't really know you were going to be on the screen tonight. We're not going to hear that much from you, but I'm really happy to see your face. So I just want to say a little bit about this book before we get started, because you're going to hear from Mandy, you're going to hear from Edie, and you're going to hear from Joey. You might be looking at Joey and wondering, how did he get his hair to not have any gray in it yet? You'll learn a little bit about why Joey is part of this book about LGBTQ elders, and it's exactly what Alex was saying about intergenerational dialogue, and it's something I know Edie and Mandy and I have talked a lot about and how important it is. And you know, that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, because I wanted young people as well as older people to be able to hear the history and the stories and the strength and the courage that people in our book have really shown for many years. So as Alex said, I'm a sexuality researcher, and I'm also a member of the LGBTQ community. And just before I wrote this book, I had just completed my doctoral research at the age of 62. I have to say, I'm very proud of that. And I did my research in a quantitative manner, which means, you know, I sent out a survey and I got results. And I did my research on LGBTQ elders' sexual satisfaction. And although I got some really incredible results, I longed to hear the stories behind the numbers. And so I embarked on this idea of a book project about what I was calling the Stonewall Generation, LGBTQ elders who had either come out around or because of or after or maybe even before the Stonewall Rebellion in New York City. And I crisscrossed the country and had a blast. And I interviewed people all over the place. Remember how much fun we had, Edie, when I came to your apartment and I met you and Jackie for the first time, and Mandy when we had that great coconut cake at the end of that interview? That was fantastic. And Joey, I met you, I ran into you at the Creating Change conference. And I went all over the country, and what I loved about it was I got to interview people who considered themselves activists as well as LGBTQ elders. And so I asked about their activist life, and I asked about social justice work. I also asked, because I'm a sex researcher, about sex. And I asked about their sexual lives. And I also asked about aging. And what I found was that people had incredible stories that no one gets to hear. And that's why I really wanted to have the book come out in print. And that's why I'm so grateful to Skinner House for picking the book up. And so it was a lot of fun to write. It really was. It was great. And I got an opportunity to learn so much. And by the end of the book, you know, it took a few years. What I realized was, oh yeah, I'm an elder too now. So this gives me great joy. And I wanted to just read a very short bit from the introduction to the book. And Edie reminded me to hold the book steady so I don't get any seasickness. How's that, Edie? Better, right? Thank you. So I want to tell you that the generation of LGBTQ people who came of age around the time of the Stonewall Rebellion lived their young adulthoods in a turbulent time. It was a time of fear, a time of secrecy, and yet in the midst of it all, the Stonewall generation has continued to fight for freedom, for rights, for love, and yes, for sex. And delving into our history can help to remind us of the courageous, inventive, and inspiring paths that LGBTQ people have taken toward liberation against a backdrop of fear. And in this time when we need hope,
Phone is still on.
God, do we need hope, when a wide swath of LGBTQ and other marginalized people are fearful that hard-won civil and human rights are being expunged and trampled upon. This book and the stories of the Stonewall generation can provide hope for those of us who live through these struggles, remind us what we've been through, and it can also be a useful tool for younger people who want to understand the historical context for their elders' lives. And I believe that this book can inform all of us, whatever age or however we identify. And today we're fighting to withstand the assaults on our rights, but I want you to remember that what Stonewall began was not just a period of fighting for rights and legislation, although those are really important, and now what we're going through, we could lose so much of that. But it was also a movement for sexual liberation. And I want to remind all of us that we can really take some great joy and pride in what our elders have fought for and what people are fighting for today. And so I'm hoping we can use this book as a way to help propel us toward more visibility, more action, more change in the future. because understanding our history allows us to help declare what we want for our futures. So especially as we're looking at the November elections, and Joey, I love that you've got vote right there. That's fantastic. It's a big concern for all of us, and we're all working really hard right now. So I'm going to stop talking now because we have so many great stories to hear. And I'd like to introduce you to our panelists, and they're going to read just short excerpts from their stories. And the way the book is organized is that each person or couple has a chapter, and they talk about their lives. And there's a beautiful photo of each one that amazing photographers who joined me on all the interviews shot of each person as a portrait, and they're lovely. And so I'm gonna ask people to read the excerpts, but I wanted you to note one more thing. And that is that, you know, I'm a white, Jewish, cis, lesbian. I could have filled the book with people who looked almost like me. But that would have continued to reify this idea that has kind of whitewashed the LGBTQ movement and kind of diminished the work, the power, and the leadership of other people of color and other marginalized people. And so what I did was I looked really hard for people to cross gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, racial identity, and regions of the country. And I hope that I was able to give you a smattering of the different kinds of people that you might run into if you're thinking about becoming more engaged with LGBTQ elders in your community, in your organization, in the work that you're doing for change. And also, I included one young person, and I'll tell you about Joey in a few minutes when I introduce him, and I'll tell you why I was so excited to have Joey to be part of this book. So let's begin by allowing me to introduce you, Mandy. And I'm just going to read from your description of the book because it sounds very official. Mandy Carter is a Southern Black lesbian activist with a movement history of more than 50 years in social, racial, and LGBTQ justice organizing. She's the co-founder of both Southerners on New Ground, SONG, an organization working toward intersectional liberation in the Southern states. And she's also a co-founder of the National Black Justice Coalition. You know, Mandy was one of the 5 national co-chairs of the Obama LGBT Pride, the LGBT initiative of Barack Obama's historic 2008 presidential campaign. And in 2012, she was inducted into the International Federation of Black Pride's Black LGBT Hall of Fame. Mandy is a co-editor of We Have Not Been Moved, Resisting Racism and Militarism in 21st Century America, that was published in 2012. Mandy Carter, welcome. And what have you got for us tonight? I don't even know.
Well, I bring you greetings from Durham, North Carolina. I am in day number 216 of our North Carolina COVID Safer at Home. I also talk about the SAGE connection. Joey, we have a SAGE chapter here in not far from Raleigh, North Carolina, our state capital, and then have that in common with Jackie and Edie as well. Jackie and Edie, we go way back to Southerners on New Ground. You know, we're now in our 7th year, so to have both of you and Jane and our little mix right here, and thank you for the folks that, sponsoring tonight. I have a short read. It's called Coming Out and Coming Home to Maud's Lesbian Bar. I'm going to keep it under that 4-minute thing, Jane, that you asked us to do. When I got to San Francisco, I was not yet 20. I was 19 in the summer of 1967. You had to be 21 to get into the bars. I found a lesbian bar called Maud's, located at 937 Cole Street. So you know what I did? I sat across the street from the bar on a stoop, watching people go in and out, night after night after night. And then the night when I turned 21, November 2nd, I went into Maud's. But the next day when they said, oh yeah, you know, we're open from noon to 2 a.m. I said, you're open during the day? You mean during broad daylight? That changed everything. That's when I realized you all can be out here in San Francisco during the day, not like that dark alley at that bar in New York, coming around the back stairs, bars named like, 12th of Never after Johnny Mathis. And an upside for me about my own coming out is because I didn't have any parents to be accountable to, because I was a wooden state of New York for my first 18 years. That is when I also realized talking.
Mandy, it's hard. Something's getting wonky with your voice. Can you just move a little bit and see if that helps? There's something about the audio.
Oh, I think I'm not talking. Can you hear me directly here?
A little bit better. Is that better? Not really.
Because I tend to be looking.
Yeah.
It was working earlier.
It just feels like there's a little lag or something. I don't know.
I could talk slower.
That's good. Yeah, that's really good.
Let me try that. And I just wonder if it's I don't have the headset that I think Alex wanted me to have. I'll talk slower.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I think that's better. Yeah.
Okay. And if it doesn't, we might have to switch to someone else.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Okay, we'll keep carrying on. We're doing great.
Okay. An upside for me about my own coming out is I didn't have any parents to be accountable to. I didn't fully appreciate and realize that until I was talking to friends who would say, oh, I can't come out because of my parents. Or what would they think and what would they say? Now that I look back at my own coming out process, I realized that for me, I had to come out to myself first, and then I would come out to other people. And one of the things that made my being out so much more easier was living in San Francisco that was so gay and so lesbian. What was happening in San Francisco in 1967 was amazing. So many gays and lesbians were moving there from outside the area, tons from the South. And the number of lesbian bars, at one point there were 14 in such a small town. That's the first time I heard the L word, not gay, but it was during the day in a lesbian bar in daylight. Then I started learning about Ricky Stryker, owner of Maud's. Turns out she was adopted, so we had that in common. Turns out she said that, turns out that she was adopted, so we had that in common. At one point, I was getting a drink with Ricky, and she said to me, you want to know something about this bar? Anyone can go to a local store and get alcohol or beer and drink it in their home for a lot cheaper. Why do they come to this lesbian bar, do you think, Mandy? They come here because they feel like they can be a part of something that identifies themselves as who they are. Ricky would say that every holiday, you're going to have a holiday meal here at the bar for those who have no place to go, either because they can't go home or they don't have a home to go to. And when you think about it, and when you think about everyone who came out at Maud's or who went there, and you look at where they are, the lineage of our leaders of our movement, some of our first openly trans people were at the first Maud unions we started, I think in 2005. They were lesbians. They came back as trans, and they were welcome. So whatever it is, whatever it was that Ricky had to say, it was just spot on. That's my piece.
That's great. Thanks, Mandy. And for folks who are listening, we're going to take questions after everybody's read. So I'm going to call on Edie next, and I'm going to just give you all a bit of just a small introduction about Edie as well. Edie's the co-founder of the Women's Energy Bank, a lesbian feminist organization that produced the feminist periodical Women's Words for more than 30 years. She also co-founded the St. Petersburg Salon, a monthly meeting place for lesbians in Western Florida. She's worked as a global peace activist, traveling to Bosnia in 1993 and to the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing in 95. It is also a member of Old Lesbians Organizing for Change, or OLOC, and Women in Black, a worldwide organization of women standing for peaceful and nonviolent conflict resolution, and, as Mandy said, Southerners on New Ground song. She's the author of Old Lesbian Memory Quilt, Stories Told by Edie Daly on her 80th birthday, and it was just published last year, 2019. And if you want to learn more about Edie, just please get a copy of her wonderful book. So Edie, what have you got for us tonight?
Well, you can see the quilt is on the back of my new bedroom here in Northampton, Massachusetts. We've just bought a condo here, and because of COVID, we couldn't go back to Florida. So here we are in Northampton, and we'll try to get home for the winter, but maybe not. So thank you very much for that introduction about some of the things that I've done in my life. But I was basically, my story starts, and as part of the book, is hidden in the suburbs. When Stonewall was happening, I was no longer living in New York City as I had been before, but I was living in the suburbs. Yorktown Heights, a bedroom community near New York City. I was living with my husband and our 3 kids, and separated from all that was gay. My husband commuted to the city, but I didn't want to have my kids raised so that I had to watch them every minute. I wanted them to be able to be free. So there I was in the suburbs with my kids in 1969. And I saw on television the treatment of the folks at Stonewall. I was still very much heterosexual. I had hidden my own identity from myself and from everybody else. I had always loved women, and I had crushes on girls and camp counselors, but I knew that it was something that was really more than that. How did I meet my husband? Well, I was a new Florida high school graduate and I was 18 in 1955 when I moved to New York City by myself to make my way in the big city. I met my future husband that night, a summer moonlight cruise up the Hudson River. I was on a blind date with another fellow, and Phil was my friend's date. It was quite a romantic evening, and we sang and danced on the boat in the moonlight, and the band and the water and the lights of the city passing by. What did I know of love except the romantic notions from the movies that filled teenagers' heads in 1950s? It was late June, and we were both working in Manhattan, only blocks from each other. He was in advertising, and I worked as a mail girl in General Electric. He called the following day and asked me if I would like to go rowing in Central Park. We spent that day together, and then the next and the next. And on July 2nd, on a little knoll in Central Park, he proposed, and I said yes, 4 days after we met. We had known each other for just those 4 days, and he was 19 and I was a smooth talker, a charmer like my dad. And I was an innocent young girl who had dated only twice. I was smitten with his charms, and I thought that this was what the American dream was about. I was supposed to get married and have kids. Secondary education was out of the question. My crushes on women were pushed firmly away. No words to even suggest what I felt for women. We were married in April in 1957, and I was 20 and Phil was 21. Our first son was born a year later, and the second 15 months after that, and the third boy was born when the first one was 3. So there I had 3 babies in diapers by 1961, and I knew that I was stuck in an abusive marriage until the youngest one was out of school. So I just put one foot in front of the other, each day saying to myself, tomorrow will be different. For 17 years, trapped in the suburbs, I did what I was supposed to do until 1974, when Doreen and I fell in love. She kissed me, and with that one kiss, my whole life unraveled. I knew without a doubt that this was what I had wanted all along. It felt like coming home. The church where I was married and where I attended from 1953 to 61 was St. Ignatius in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It was known as the gay church at the time, and nothing was talked about then. There was just something that was understood. Almost every one of the men that attended most of the folks in the church, including the rector, were probably gay. They were in the arts, and it was high Episcopal church. And we all loved the pomp and ritual. Later on, I learned that my husband had had affairs with almost all the gay men in the church. So I thought to myself, this frees me up some. And 14 years later, I fell in love with the woman, and we worked on the same school system. I was a teacher aide, and she was the teacher. And of course, we would have both been fired if there was anything overt between us. I fell in love with her in 1974, 5 years after Stonewall. And I can remember at one point, my husband calling her husband in the middle of the night and saying, you know what, Marty? My wife is having an affair with your wife. You are crazy, Phil Daly, he said, and he hung up the phone. The thing I realized when I came out was that it was like coming home for me. It was indeed a place where I knew that this is who I am.
Oh, beautiful. These are great, great readings. Thank you so much, Edie.
You're welcome.
So, and our third panelist tonight is Joey Wasserman, who not only is the Senior Director of Development at SAGE, which, as we said before, is one of the oldest and largest nonprofit organizations dedicated to the needs of older LGBT people. But after graduating from York College in York, Pennsylvania, Joey worked in Washington, D.C. for the Human Rights Campaign. He also worked for Dining Out for Life in Chicago and as a consultant to various local and national LGBT rights organizations, including the Freedom to Marry. He's also worked on Democratic political campaigns, including Senator Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential run. You can see that he's really interested in electoral politics if you look just to his right. And he's a native of Philadelphia. Joey Wasserman, welcome. I'm so happy to see you again. What have you got for us to read tonight?
Happy to be, can you hear me? Perfect. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you, Jane, Brookline, and it's an honor to be on the panel with Edie, Jackie, and Mandy, so thank you. This excerpt is going to talk about how we honor the history of our movement and ensure that we do make intergenerational connections moving forward. Whether you like it or not, we're all getting older, but the aging process is different for everyone, and how you embrace it will determine your life's trajectory. As a younger gay man, I don't think about it all too much, but I do notice it can be a point of internal struggle for many in this community, both young and old. Ultimately, it's not our thoughts, emotions, or words that define us, but the impact that we have on others, our community, and the world. It starts with knowing your values and understanding that they will evolve over time as a function of an ever-changing environment. That's okay to challenge preconceived notions and instead explore new ideas to help form your values and ignite your passions. Aging in general isn't always terribly sexy, let alone in the LGBT community. But over the years, I have realized that age is just a number, and our communities offer so much more in-depth richness and vibrancy. This realization didn't come overnight, but I saw it over time and started to appreciate that we are just strongest when we're united. Putting words into action, I have made it central to my life to impart knowledge and awareness regarding age and intergenerational engagement to those who I surround myself with. This includes involving my friends in campaigns and events I produce on behalf of SAGE. Not only do they see the value in supporting those who have come before us, but they also enjoy hearing their stories and learning more about our collective history. And at its core, after decades of discrimination and harassment, many celebrate the openness and campiness of our elders and our friends. Whether it's just going to Julius, a historic LGBT bar in the village, or visiting Sean and Nick's Courtyard Cafe and LGBT diner in Fort Lauderdale. Whenever I'm in town, there's always someone with a story to tell and a lesson to be learned. These are the types of environment I grew up in. It wasn't unusual to hear the banter, silliness, and friendly insults between two old gay queens in my parents' restaurant and bar when I was growing up. I used to work there from time to time, and I loved it. So many characters and dynamic personalities can only be found in the LGBT bar scene. Also, there's a unique comfort of open criticism specific to the older LGBTQ population that isn't prevalent amongst the younger generation. It's very similar to what you would find in a Jewish deli in the 1950s and 60s, the shared history of persecution and finding the laughter through tears. I think you're on mute, Jane.
Thank you, Joey. That was fantastic. All the stories are so great tonight that you shared. And I love that there's some connections, right? I mean, in the book, the bar scene was such a prevalent theme because of both the police intimidation and harassment, but also the love and the community that people found, that both you were talking about, Mandy, around mods, and also what you were talking about, Joey, you know, growing up in Venture Inn in Philadelphia, but also in many other bars. And also, I just wanted to say that another theme that came through in the book so much was the joys of being older and finding ourselves and finding our community. And I think, you know, I loved so many parts of your story, Edie, when you talked about what it was like, and when you said the words, it was like coming home. That really, really resonated for me. And for those of you who haven't gotten a chance to read the book yet, and I really want you to read it, it is fantastic. Not just because I'm part of it, but because all of these folks are here. And there are 6 other amazing, fierce, powerful people. Miss Major Griffin Gracie, who some of you might know, who's been really a beacon of love and hope in the transgender community, and has been fighting for years about the disproportionate incarceration of transgender women of color, particularly. Dave Bermudez is also in the book. He was actually at Stonewall that night, and you know, he's a Puerto Rican gay man, and he and his husband, Bob Isidore, live pretty close to Boston on the Cape, and they're in the book. Lani Kahumanu, some of you might know her because she's one of the co-authors of a really important book called Bi, B-I, Any Other Name, really talking about bisexuality, and probably one of the first compendiums. Also, Imani Woody Mako is in the book, and she's another African-American lesbian activist, has dedicated her life to really looking at LGBT elders and the issues of housing and housing discrimination. And finally, Hardy Hagerman is also in the book, who's from Dallas, and another amazing, fierce leader, leader in the leather community and in the kink community, and has been on the board of the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Foundation for many years. And so you'll learn about each of these amazing people's stories, and also you'll hear about theirs as well. So Alex, can I call you back to give us a little bit of help here? Alex?
I wanted to also just introduce Jackie. Jackie's my wife, and Jackie Merkin is also in the book. She has a chapter as well. And there's the connection that we met through a woman that through SAGE. We were both members of SAGE, but we didn't know each other, but there was a mutual friend who introduced us. But so SAGE has been a part of our lives since the very beginning, and then that was in 1997.
Wow, amazing. Thanks, Edie. So I haven't been looking at the chat because I'm mesmerized. But Alex, we need your help. So
Yeah,
you do this more than we do. So can you help us out here?
sure. Actually, look, we just got a question in the chat. I'm going to grab that before it disappears.
Okay.
So Terry is asking, can panelists share thoughts on the bisexual community and what you've heard over the years? What messages do you receive about bisexual folks?
Great question. I'll start it off, and anybody feel free to add a little bit. Lonnie Kahamanu, who I mentioned just a moment ago, talks about the biphobia that she faced in the lesbian community. She had originally come out as a lesbian, and she said it was, to great fanfare. And yet when she came out as bisexual, she felt like she was really ostracized. And Lonnie, who has a great laugh and has an enormous amount of joy, also has suffered tremendous pain because of the bias within our community. And she has been fighting against that biphobia for many, many years. There's a wonderful photo of her in the book in the San Francisco Pride March, holding a sign that says biphobia, and it had her, she had her biceps. And anyway, she's an incredible activist, and I think reading her story has really, I think, educated me as well as lots of people about just the enormous difficulty we have within our own movement, and then, of course, sexuality. Anybody else want to talk a little bit about bisexuality, biphobia, any of that? Mandy?
And can you hear me okay when I'm talking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, good. I just want to make a very interesting point about these marches we've had. Stonewall happened in 1969. We had the 1979, and 10 years later was the Gay and Lesbian March in D.C. Then we had one in 1987, Gay and Lesbian. But interestingly enough, for the 1993 March, this is where the bi issue became pretty controversial, because people didn't want to use the word bisexual, so it was called the 1993 March for Lesbian, Gay, and Bi Equality. And when I think about Lonnie and I think about Rob and some other folks who have been so dedicated to this issue, what's the deal on that? And you'll get the usual, but I think we've come a long way. But what I love, Jane, and also Edie, and thinking of who's on this call, now we have the LGBTIA, and there seems to be more receptivity. And maybe, Joel, you could address this as well. Why was there such pushback? And let alone the B word, what about L word? Michigan fell apart because you had this whole issue about who was self-identified and who was born or not born, and you wonder, why are we getting into this tough? But I just remember that 93 March. And then more importantly, real quick, when, thanks to Leslie Feinberg, when we ended up adding the T, when people said, don't put the T in there, and then you realize, maybe say not you, then who's next? Anyway.
Really good point.
People often ask me and say, well, since you were married, aren't you bisexual? And I say, I was married at one point, but I've always really been lesbian. I just didn't act on it. I acted on what was expected of me, what the American dream was supposed to be, and how that is. And so when the pushback with bisexuality, and is that one of the things to me is that we banded together in those early days for support and for acceptance. And then as we got more and more of the letters added in, there became more divisions, because we were kind of united in the beginning when there was so much oppression for all of us. that united us. Whereas now, I think because there's so much is accepted, it's also the way that our Western civilization, if you can call it that, separates things into boxes. You have to fit in the box. And so there's those, everybody's boxes, and it's your box, not my box. We're not just part of the same continuum.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think it would be beautiful if we could all see each other as humans, right? But back in the day, you know what, to advance our community forward, you know, we had to unite, right? We had to come together, and especially during like a crisis like the AIDS happened, where many people in the LGBT community, especially the lesbian community, stepped up, you know, to help one another. But it's so sad that I think the BNT is although there's a lot of progress, as you mentioned, Mandy, that we've made towards to be more in an inclusive environment, I still think there's work to be done for other segments of our community. And I think that a traditional thought, you know, about bisexuality is that that's the path to something else, right? Which is totally false, you know. But I think there's a lot to be explored, a lot to be discussed about bisexuality, and I think bringing that question up, Terry, is the starting point, and I hope people continue having discussions about it.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. You know, I was thinking, Joey, you brought up an issue of language. The word bisexual didn't always mean what it means today, and so that's interesting too. And that was part of the process of learning from each other in this book, that some people use language that may not be the same language that other people use, and we had to really actually kind of figure that out as we were working together. But I also want to say something else about bisexuality. Joy mentioned the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and that was one of the times when bisexuals, and this is a really interesting piece of research that I just read about a year ago, a study done by a woman who's looking at bisexuality in America. And she said that was one of the first times that bisexuals were really sort of embraced in this movement. And I remember 30 years ago, maybe, might have been more, where we had a big argument about should the bisexuals be allowed into the march. It was sort of what Mandy was just talking about. Now, this is a local march, and I remember that, you know, people weren't real excited about that. There was a lot of frustration about it. And then it reminds me of what Ms. Major told me about why do we have the letters lined up LGBTQ, you know, as we keep going. Why did the T get so far at the end? You know, as far as Ms. Major is concerned, trans women were right in the forefront of the Stonewall Rebellion. Couldn't it have been the T, LGBT? You get what I'm saying here? Because we fought to get the L into the acronym, right? We fought really hard. I remember back in Hartford, Connecticut, there might be some people on this call tonight who remember those meetings where we said, this isn't just a gay rights movement, this is lesbians and gay rights. And then we expanded from there. So it's really important that we look at some of this historical moments to understand how this all occurred. Yeah, thanks, great question.
So this actually, I think, leads into a question that Lorraine has posted, which is about old lesbians organizing for change. And she says that a mixed race OLOC chapter did not form in Atlanta specifically because of active transphobia from some members of leadership. So directed to Edie, who I think has had some involvement with the group in the past, although I don't know much about that. So I pass it to you. Why do you think there's hesitation amongst some leaders of OLOC towards treating transgender women as real women?
Well, one of the things that OLOC says that they don't ask, it's kind of like don't ask, don't tell. If you present as a lesbian, as an old lesbian over 60, nobody looks at your credentials. And so that's the official way. Something happened between those women of color and the basically white women that are the leaders of OLAC happened that year. I was not part and parcel. I don't know about what happened, but it was very disturbing to me that I always say, if the women can't figure out how to get along, how can we expect the guys to do it?
I know, Lorraine, and I'm really familiar with this issue, but here's an interesting way to look at this. Sometimes you have adversity and you feel like trying to figure out a way, whatever the at the moment established thing might be. At some point you realize it probably is not going to change, so you end up doing something exciting, start something new. And I remember when we were thinking about 1967, 68, you had not only the AIDS issue going on, but Vietnam War was happening as well. And I remember a lot of women, I'm trying to think of some names you would recognize when I say the name. Barbara Deming wrote this whole wonderful book about pacifism and feminism, and how there was this intricate reality of that. Also, the National Organization for Women, when there was a whole kind of lavender menace, no lesbians here. And some people said, well, if now wants to continue to feel like we don't exist, we can either fight it or we say we're going to start something new. That probably had more to do with that sort of a lesbian, feminist, wonderful, so one to be consumed with adversity and I'm going to change it or I'm not going to change it, or you might say bye and go make something else happen. So there's an interesting twist about how this might end up. And demographically, things are shifting. And can I just end with maybe one thing? I'm going to ask people on this. When I meet someone, I'll just ask this question: how do you self-identify? And let the person at that moment, at that time, to say, this is how I self-identify. And if you understand and value me and whatever, appreciate me, then give me the pronoun, whatever it might be. But you're not automatic, no, it's going to have to be this, and sit and fight. I can say bye and go make something else happen. So this is the thought.
Yeah, I hear you, Mandy. It's a generational thing, right? Very often how people identify. And I was in an intergenerational discussion group that Edie and Jackie and some other women from OLAC led a few years ago, and it was clear that people were identifying in different ways. It was older and younger lesbians, but some of the lesbians who were younger didn't identify as lesbians. Very interesting. Yeah. I think also when I was younger, when I was first coming out, I was very scared to use the word lesbian. It was very frightening. I didn't know what was going to be in front of me. And so, many people who are in the heterosexual world don't understand that coming out is a process, but it's also layers. You come out to maybe people in this part of your life or in that part of your life, but it was scary to come out in all parts of my life. So I remember how I identified really was based on the context and who was in front of me.
It's very wise. We have a question from Dennis, who asks, what do you see as the LGBTQ activists' agenda for a Biden administration, especially for older LGBTQ folks?
Joey, you're on. This is your domain. The Biden administration, everyone, get it? We are hopeful here tonight. We are stubbornly hopeful. Joey or Mandy, any of you, what do you all think?
Yeah, I think, first of all, we need to get through all the noise, right? Let's accomplish that first step. But I had to actually take off my SAGE hat because SAGE is a nonpartisan organization. But from a personal perspective, right, I think there's a lot of advancements that can be had with the administration of Biden and Kamala administration. And I think LGBT older adults, are especially isolated during this time. And we're seeing the vulnerability, we've seen the vibrancy of our community over the decade, and we've been able to meet certain challenges even without the support of the government, right? And I think we've been able to make some progress during the Trump administration, but right now it is definitely the sky's the limit. I think there's many priorities on the ticket right now, and one being LGBT inclusive rights. I think we need to continue advancing trans rights, right? I think we need to continue advancing LGBT people of color and the Black community, especially older adults, where they are especially more disadvantaged from the start. LGBT elders are 4 times less likely to have children, They are twice as likely to be single, So there's not the support system in place for many older adults. And I think it's a multifaceted approach of ensuring that we kind of educate care providers on what it means to be LGBT inclusive, right? So passing and implementing the Older American Act. This past year, we were able to adopt LGBT inclusive policy in the Older American Act, which distributes about $2 billion, to programs like Meals on Wheels, right? That's a first step, but the implementation, is a secondary step, which is somewhat can be difficult and challenging if you don't have the infrastructure in place. So I think with the Biden administration, I think it's kind of identifying where those gaps are that have been left with the current president, and trying to advance, and push forward inclusive policy for those who have been left behind.
That does sum it up nicely, I think. Yeah, push forward, refuse to slip back. I do have time for one more question. And I think given our panel and many other things, I think this is a good place to end. Joan asks, what advice do you have to give for intergenerational queer friendships?
Real quick, there's an interesting demographic that would really put this in context. Right now, our baby boomers born between the years of 1946 and 1964, there's about 74 million of us, but 18 to 35-year-olds are going to be about 75 million. If ever there was a moment to have this intentional intergenerational conversation in reality. But I'll tell you now, right now with COVID, it's coming out in real ways. I used to be a poll worker. I'm not going to be one here in Durham, North Carolina. Young folk are sitting up and trying to figure out how can I end up being also a poll worker, but work in partnership and then keep that partnership moving forward. That to me is going to be key out of necessity, but then also out of just reality check. That's the future that I would say. That would be my answer. It's already happening. Bring it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mandy. Let's take a look at the millions of young people who are in the streets right now, fighting for racial justice, fighting against police brutality, fighting against the rights that have been trampled upon. Let's make sure that we as elders allow young people to move forward into those leadership positions. It is a time right now where there is a movement afoot. And, our time, I was a leader at one point, and I can step back now because I feel like there are so many brilliant young people, particularly young people of color and young people who are trans and young people who are really feeling marginalized in so many ways. I'd love to see us make room to hear those voices so that we can, again, make room for more people. So yeah, I'd love to have more of it. And if people want to get in touch with us, we should put a way to do that because we've got this Facebook page set up, Alex, on for anybody who wants to have more conversations about the book and any of us. And I've been putting a lot of content on there each week. It's a lot of fun. And we'd love to hear more intergenerational conversations between young and old LGBTQ folks. Anybody else have anything to say on that one?
just be open. You know, keep your mind open. Yeah, life is about so many experiences and stories, and that's one of the joys, right, in life.
I think one of the things too is this book is a marvelous book for a text for any high school or college level. And it's a wonderful book that will open up those kinds of conversations in the young communities. So thank you very much for, you know, writing this. As it's really a history book.
I just want to say I agree, because this isn't history that young people receive formally most of the time. And it means that there is this huge gaping hole in the understanding of young queer people of their own histories and identities, and being handed some of that history, some of that living history, and some of that lost history is so vital to make the generations feel relevant to each other and to be able to support each other.
So Alex, we want to thank you at Brookline Booksmith, and we want to say to everybody, buy a book from Brookline Booksmith tonight. Just do it. You know how to do it. It's not that hard. Alex, you could probably put a link in the chat. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm going to do that.
We don't have time.
Sounds good.
And, you know, one of the things I want to say is, if we didn't have the launch tonight, we wouldn't know what kind of response we could get from people, and the response has been so beautiful tonight. So thanks, Alex. Thanks, Brookline Booksmith. Thanks to SAGE for co-sponsoring, yes. And thanks, Mandy, Edie, Jackie, and Joey. It's been really great to be with all of you tonight.
Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful evening. This was a great event, and it was great to see all of you here. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.